Good afternoon. Here, thank you, Dr. Morey, Professor Dr. Morey, and it's an interesting experience for me to be here. Thank you so much to be at this prestigious university here in Kyoto as well as in Japan generally, for which I have great admiration and respect. Let me say it was 35 years ago when I had left Taiwan as a young graduate student. I was speaking at a Rotary Club in Taipei in 1975, where I met probably the most famous Protestant, Norman Vincent Peale, and that same year, the most famous evangelical, Billy Graham. I met both of them that year, and it was actually my plan at that point in life to go back to the United States, finish my graduate studies in political science, and when China opened, I would become a foreign service officer to China. But it was Dr. Norman Vincent Peale and Dr. Billy Graham who persuaded me to do otherwise, and I'm so glad that they did. I'll tell a story that I have told to Iranian ayatollahs, I've told it to Israeli rabbis, I've told it even in Lhasa, Tibet, to Tibetan Buddhists, and the story goes like this. Evangelical is driving his Jeep Cherokee over hill and dale, and he sees a shepherd who's quietly out tending his flock. He jumps out of his truck and goes over to speak to this shepherd. He says to the shepherd, who's quite shocked by having him come upon him as he has, he says to the shepherd, this American evangelical, he says, "If I can tell you how many sheep you have, can I have one?" The shepherd is quite dumbstruck by all of this, and of course he says yes. So the American goes back into his truck, gets on GPS. I call that God's positioning satellite. Most other people don't call it that, but I call it that. And within a few moments, he goes back to the shepherd and he says, "You have 1,681 sheep." Responds, "That's totally amazing. How did you know? Go pick one out." So the American goes over, the American evangelical, he goes over and picks one out, puts it in his truck, and he's driving away when the shepherd runs up and knocks on his window. Well, the shepherd says to him, he says, if I can tell you what you do for a living, can I have my sheep back? And the American evangelical says, "Yes, if you can tell me what I do for a living." And the shepherd says, "That's very simple. You are a consultant." The American, in astonishment, he says, "Well, that's exactly right. How did you know?" And the shepherd says, "Well, that's very simple." He said, "You come into my world, you answer questions I've never asked, leave out, charge me a lot of money. But most of all," he says, "you don't know anything. You don't know diddly squat." He says, "You took my sheepdog." Even the Iranians, the Chinese, the Israelis, everyone understands the perils of being a consultant. Well, I don't want to be a consultant who comes here and attempts to answer questions you don't have. But I do believe there are important things that you need to know that are occurring in America. And thus, I'm very excited to tell you about them. I often tell my audiences, ask yourself this question. Which is it that you believe? Now, you've come here today to hear about theology and history and political science and many disciplines. But I would like to say that most of my audiences, I ask this question. There are two types of people in the world, G.K. Chesterton wrote 100 years ago. There are those, the first type, they believe that when the trees are waving wildly in the wind, the first group of people, they think it's the wind that moves the trees. Thinks that the motion of the trees creates the wind. The former view was held by humankind through most of its centuries, and it's only in recent years that a new breed of people have emerged who blindly hold that it's the movement of the trees that creates the wind. For centuries, the consensus has always held that the invisible is behind and gives energy to the visible. In other words, the consensus has always been that the invisible is behind and gives energy to the visible. But that consensus has broken down. And I would like to say to you that the first view is that held by the Judeo-Christian tradition. The second view, namely that it's the motion of the trees that creates the wind, is a kind of metaphor for secularism, for relativism in the West. The human dogma is that the wind moves the trees. the great human heresy is that the trees move the wind. What I'm going to say to you today is that there are 3 reasons we are at a defining moment in human history, and that there are 3 things that distinguish the modern day new evangelicals from their parents and grandparents. And those 3 things are that we have, as new evangelicals, we have a new vision, we have a new strategy, and we have new tactics. But I want you to know, first of all, that I believe, most importantly, and it affects you as much as we in the West, we are at a defining moment in human history for 3 different reasons. Today, it's a very troubling time. It's a troubling time because they worry. They worry about terrorism, the growing poverty and unemployment in America. They worry about the uncertainty from overextending our nation into 2 wars at one time, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And for many millions of people, it's as if the wheels of civilization are coming off. There's this other question of whether or not the reigning worldviews can solve these problems. In other words, the ideas and solutions that we've operated under for decades in America and have worked in the past no longer seem to work because the conditions in the situation has changed. And I would suggest to you that this is why we are at a defining moment. We must make this shift in 3 ways. We must make a shift in our thinking, in our perception, and in our behavior in order to succeed in this, the 21st century. And one example of this is the shift in the Renaissance, which followed the Middle Ages, a period of darkness and ignorance, which unleashed in the Renaissance a flourishing of European artistic and scientific achievement. And many people today, in looking back at that period, say that the roots of the Renaissance were intellectual and ideological change as much as substantive change. In other words, that was one of those defining moments in human history, this shift from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. And what is required today is a similar kind of shift in thinking, perception, and behavior. We are at a defining moment, first of all, because a great shift in energy and power is occurring in human history. The economic revolution throughout time, for example, has been driven by a transition, a shift in energy, because energy powers every aspect of human activity. The shift you see to renewables, that is, solar, geothermal, wind, and the rest, these are simply a reflection of a shift in energy that we're going to have to make in the way we think, perceive, and behave in very fundamental ways. The irony of it is that this shift causes, at times, an upheaval that stresses people in ways they wouldn't otherwise feel stressed. You see, the upheaval and stress that accompanies these transformations also tend to provoke legions of doomsayers and end-of-times religious revivals. You may have heard of the Left Behind series. It is the most famous book series, probably the most popular in American history. Over 40 million copies have been sold and another 17 million in spin-offs. The authors of the Left Behind series, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, annually receive approximately over $100 million from the sales of these books. Picture, the Left Behind sagas begin with a mysterious event. One of the third of the passengers on a transatlantic flight suddenly disappear, leaving only their clothes behind. What has happened? In an instant, it's what evangelicals call the rapture, where every true believing Christian and every child under the age of 12 vanishes in an instant to a better place, and all others face the tribulation. There is even a radio series called Family Radio that today predicts the end of the earth on April 12th of 2011 that will be followed by the tribulation and the return of Jesus Christ, and ultimately you see the end of the earth in October of 2011. And this is broadcast over the worldwide network of Family Radio. In fact, you can simply go to familyradio.org and you can read it about it. The end is almost here, is what it's called, www.familyradio.org. The end is nearer than you think, is the message. Say to yourself, what in the world does this have to do with the new evangelicals? Finding one of those defining moments is that of energy and the end times dispute. And what is occurring is that the new evangelicals, you see, who have taken the position, as have I, that we have a responsibility to care for this earth, find themselves care for this earth, that is, in this shift toward renewable energies and the like, we have a responsibility to care for earth because we believe that climate change, global warming, will affect not just millions but billions of people around the globe. And these two communities find themselves quite at different mentalities about the future. One is expecting, you see, the imminent return of Jesus Christ to be raptured to another world and to leave this world in tribulation. And the other, the new evangelicals, are simply saying, now wait just a minute. Wait just a minute. Are we going to leave this earth unattended? To deny our responsibility to care for it because we believe we're going to be raptured to another earth? And so you have this dispute, the first one, the first defining moment over these two communities in the religious world. Those in the evangelicals who say, oh, we need not care for this earth. And the other community saying, we will care for it. Second dispute and the second defining moment, I would suggest to you, is the dispute that is occurring even between new evangelicals and old evangelicals over the question of religion and science. Religious fundamentalists still attack science as dangerous and untrustworthy and point to a literal interpretation of the Bible as the only reliable means of discerning scientific truth. On the other side, there is what are called the new atheists. Voices such as that of Richard Dawkins, who takes the position that a belief in evolution demands atheism. Richard Dawkins says that faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. One side rejects faith, the other side rejects science. And we among the new evangelicals, as well as reasonable people in America, we reject the inescapable end result of these two views, namely that we are forced to choose between these two extremes. Richard Dawkins is on one side. On the other is a very famous Christian who has now been appointed by President Obama as head of the National Institutes of Health. His name, the head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, he has put it another way. What Mr. Collins says is that there is no conflict here. He says God's domain is to explore the spiritual world. Science's domain is to explore nature. And he says these two worlds, you see, need one another. He says that, you see, to take the one side, that of Richard Dawkins, and reject faith, he says that is wrong. He says the other side, to reject faith, is also wrong. That we have a mutually exclusive choice here. He says that both choices deny truth, both choices are profoundly dangerous, both will diminish the nobility of mankind, and he says both will be devastating to our future. Like our forefathers, that is in the evangelical world, the new evangelicals see no conflict between faith and science, and would frankly like to take a different position than their parents and grandparents. It's a huge difference, and it has political implications. When I came out and supported a number of years ago the position that climate change is real, it provoked a huge backlash against me in the evangelical world. He said, oh, Cizik has joined the liberals. He's joined the scientific community. He's joined the environmentalists. He's joined all those left-wingers, you see, who believe that all that matters is Mother Earth. Look at the Bush administration took advantage of the anti-science, you see, views of American evangelicals to push its support for the fossil fuel industry. This is pretty clear. And the new evangelicals back President Obama's new energy policies and want to see an international treaty to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so the fact, though, that they're